All right. Part 8 of raising cash, right? Growing your network of investors. What are we talking about today? Talking about something like I had mentioned before I started recording. This is potentially going to be kind of like a twofold day. And we're going over one thing that kind of bleeds into another thing. And if we have time, we'll go into the secondary thing. If we don't, we'll just go into the next time we meet, and it'll be like part 8.2 or just part 9, whatever I decide. But what we're going to be discussing today, I guess I need to start sharing my screen, is webinars, fellas. I'm sure you guys have been on a webinar or two, or maybe you haven't, but I'm sure you've maybe got the email blasts about folks doing webinars and they got these awesome investment opportunities and come to the live webinar, or here's the pre-recorded version or what have you. So we're going to be going over how to actually execute on your own webinar when you start raising cash, right? And there's a lot of different facets we're going to go over today about webinars, but really what we're focusing on is how, and right here, basically how you can execute on a top-notch webinar. Different questions that investors are going to ask that you should kind of expect. What should be included in a webinar? What does all that stuff look like? So jumping in straight away, number one, executing on a top-notch webinar. As passive investor is evaluating a potential real estate syndication investment opportunity, weighing whether or not to invest. The webinar can be one of the most valuable sources of insight into whether or not the deal will be a home run or a total flop. And that may seem kind of ridiculous. You may think, well, how's the webinar going to be the one determining factor of whether or not this deal actually makes sense or doesn't make sense? And we're going to go into why that is and some of the specifics of, and kind of like psychology almost, that's going to go into why webinars are important and why it's important to do one, and how we can make sure we do one successfully for our investor base. So jumping into the meat and potatoes of today, we'll be discussing what to expect in an investor webinar, why they're so valuable, and considering whether to invest in a particular real estate syndication, when they generally take place, questions you should ask / include in your webinar. So what is a webinar, right? Well, an investor webinar is a conference call or online meeting. It's led by members of the sponsor team, typically the GPs of some sort. And if there's co-GPs, or if there's just you and your business partner or your few business partners, whoever it is, typically all the GPs are at least saying something in the webinar, putting forth some kind of effort to talk about some aspect of the deal, or at least introduce themselves at the very least on the call. Often webinars take place through a platform like Zoom or Google Hangouts. Right? Each sponsor has their own preference. You can choose whichever you like. We've always used Zoom, just like we do here today, just like what we're doing right now, quite literally just recording it and going over your PDF or slideshow or slide deck and having the ability to then send that out to the people that didn't get to make the live webinar. Sponsors typically walk through the investment summary, highlighting things like the deal structure, business plan, market comps, their own track record. Just because you offer a webinar doesn't mean you'll automatically raise the capital either, right? And there's some key execution strategies at play here. In my experience, whenever possible, sponsors want to offer webinars, or really need to, if you're trying to really raise any kind of decent amount of cash, like for a particular investment, as they want investors to feel comfortable and confident in the deal and in the partnership, right? Because 9 times out of 10, they're investing in you, not necessarily the specific investment. And so they really get a feel for who you are by hearing how you explain the deal, how you're actually portraying it, what your actual business plan is. They're getting a better feel for how much you actually know about the business outside of just you having a one-on-one conversation with them. How do you actually portray yourself, maybe in a group setting, or, all those different things. Investors want to feel comfortable and confident in the deal and in the partnership. After all, most of these projects take place over multiple years, right? So better to get comfortable with each other sooner rather than later. This also helps you as the GP determine whether or not you even want that particular LP or investor anyway, because they could be extremely pesky, constantly interrupting you to ask questions that that you would have answered if they hadn't opened their mouth, right? If they hadn't have just continuously interrupted you time and time again. Of course, you'll get a better feel for that particular LP, that particular individual, and whether or not you actually want them as an investor. There has been a few times that we have actually turned away people investing in our deals. And more often than not, it's for their sake, not necessarily our sake. Like maybe they're like scraping the cash together. They don't have a lot of extra cash lying around. So this is kind of a very important amount of capital to them. Or maybe they've just never done this before and they need to get a little bit more comfortable with the business or need to understand the metrics a little better before just throwing cash into a deal. Because what we found is that the investors that are investing the smallest amount, like the $25,000 investors or the $15,000 investors or whatever, like your lowest minimum is, those are the ones that ask the most questions. Those are the ones that pester you the most. They're always blowing up your phone, blowing up your inbox, wanting to know where their money is, how the deal's doing. And the investors that invest 50, 100, 200, $300,000, they're the ones that give you the money, wire it, and then they hear from you when you send stuff, and they're not really bothering you all too much because they've got plenty of extra cash and plenty of other things that are more important in their life that's going on, right? They're just trusting that you know what you're doing. Now, some sponsors offer a live webinar that's also recorded, which is what I recommend, what we primarily do, send out to investors afterward. Others offer only a recorded webinar. So some actually don't like to do the live webinar. They like to just look to the screen and talk about the whole thing, record it, and then send it out to people. But then it doesn't give your investors the option to ask questions and do the back and forth. And I just don't feel like you succeed as much when you try to do a recorded webinar. Some webinars are led by one person, others take on more of a panel format, right? We're talking about you and your business partners, and maybe you've got some other co-GPs or something. And then again, I personally recommend doing a live webinar that you also record, because then not only the people that are asking the questions on the call that you get recorded, but then all those that missed, you can send them the webinar. And then investors that want to invest like 2 weeks before the deal closes, you've probably already done the webinar 2 or 3 weeks prior. So instead of having to do another webinar or talk to them one-on-one and have some detailed conversation over this, going over another hour like you did with the webinar, is something you just quickly send them so that they can get a more detailed understanding. Because a lot of times, a lot of the questions that investors ask are the same questions that every other investor in the world is going to ask you. So if you just already record it and answer it, then it's just easy and simple to move things along a little quicker, right? Really scale your ability to raise and close this deal. Now, as your passive investors are thinking about investing in a particular deal, the webinar is an incredibly valuable source of information. You'll be the one leading the entire project, handling the day-to-day operations, communications, oversight. So the webinar is a fantastic opportunity for your investors to get to know you a little better. We talked about this a little bit, better understand your business strategy and how they will feel like you will actually be able to execute. So number 3, why investor webinars are so valuable. Webinar will offer your investors a special perspective or lens into the way that you and your business partners, actually operate. Help them understand if you seem to be the right fit for them, not to mention the incredible detail that will be discussed about the actual investment as well. The webinar gives you a chance to hear directly from your investors as to their primary concerns, so you can best combat why they believe or don't believe in this investment. It gives them a chance to ask their questions and to hear how other investors are actually thinking about the opportunity, because some investors are kind of on the fence. They join the webinar just because they heard about it. They've been following you for a while. They kind of like what you're doing, but they don't know a lot about it. Maybe they've never even had a one-on-one conversation with you, but they got the email or they got the whatever to know that this webinar was happening at XYZ date. They signed up, they showed up, and they're getting to see how other investors are asking questions or interacting with you and what they're actually thinking about the investment. And sometimes just the way that they watch other people interact has actually, of course, allowed them to think a little bit differently and actually entice them to want to invest, because they're like, oh, well, I didn't even think about it that way, or I didn't think about this. Whether it's other investors asking it or whether it's just you actually pitching the webinar in the first place, like what you're actually talking about live with your business plan and your strategy. Like, oh, I didn't even think about those things. He makes good points. This may be something that I'm actually interested in. And maybe the webinar is something like you go over all the detailed business plans, and then at the end you say that you're accepting, retirement account investments like 401ks and IRAs, and they're like, oh shoot, I didn't even know I could do that. I've got $100,000 in an old retirement account that I forgotten about transferring to this other job. And so now you've just given them this new idea, this new access to cash they didn't even know they had. And now maybe they're interested in jumping into this deal. So when the actual webinars take place, typically an investment opportunity opens up with a general new deal announcement, got some kind of email blast or text message blast. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. You got your A list of investors. You can literally call that. Well, what I do is I actually call my A list of investors. So those that have invested with us time and time again, or that have shown extreme interest and have like requested to be on the A list, like, hey, I've got $1 million. Like, you're going on the A list. I'll let you know as soon as a new deal comes about. So instead of just, they get the email like everybody else does, but even before the email, they get an actual one-on-one phone call from me telling them about the opportunity. And then on top of that, then the A/B list investors, those that basically all have actually invested with us before, they're going to get a text message actually from me. So it's a little bit cumbersome. I'm sure there's a software or platform out there that you can do like a mass text blast, and I just haven't implemented it in my business. It probably would help me tremendously. But I actually go down the list one by one and text. It's really just copy and paste, right? Text each individual investor that's ever invested with us before, and they get that personalized text message from me when the new deal comes to life. And then more often than not, we raise the majority, if not all, the cash just from that. However, if we don't, that's when the email goes out, right? That's when the mass blast goes out. Hey, new deal. We're already 50% subscribed or 75% subscribed or whatever. And then people are like, oh my gosh, I just got this email and they're already like full. I need to jump on this. So a little bit of a FOMO there that kind of goes in with that. But usually after the investment summary is made available for investors to review, the sponsors will offer a webinar. So same thing we do once the email blast goes out, or once we've raised some cash, we typically schedule the webinar for probably about 1 to 2 weeks, maybe after that date of when we actually launch, to say that, the deal's live, which is typically after we've already gotten all the SEC docs put together. Now, sometimes we haven't gotten all the docs put together yet, but we'll have them all put together by the time the webinar actually happens. Because what we like to do is once the webinar actually goes live, we have people jumping on, we like to try to have the bank account and if the bank account isn't ready, then that's fine. At the very least, we like to have all the docs ready and like everything in the portal. So once we go through and everyone looks at it, they can either take some time to think about it if they feel like they need to do that, or if they're ready to go. Some investors are just ready to go right then and there. Then you say, here's the next step, right? Here's what you do next. So the whole next step piece, we like to already have set up. Like, go on to our investor portal, log in, create your free account if you don't already have one, and then click on, Riverside or whatever the name of this investment is, and then just follow the prompts. You'll be able to sign all the docs there. You'll be able to see exactly the slides and the PPM and the pitch deck and everything we've gone over today. Then you can commit to the investment amount that you'd like. Once you finish signing all the docs, you'll get the wiring instructions, and then bam, you send the money to the bank account. We'll let you know if the bank account is up and running. If it's not, we'll just hold off on wiring yet. But if it is, you can go ahead and wire the money today, and we'll confirm on our end when we have that, and we'll update you via the portal. So we like to have all that kind of squared away when the actual webinar happens, so that we have the ability to start accepting commits, and we're not like scrambling and like, just let us know. And then we write it on a spreadsheet of like, hey, so-and-so said they want to do 100 grand. No, I want to have it all like firm, professional, in the portal, ready to go. Even though it's not critical for you to put on a live webinar, it's important to note that many investors rely on the webinar as the final linchpin or decision-making point when deciding whether or not to invest in a deal. It's because they want to hear about the deal directly from the sponsors who'll be running it. Given that most real estate syndication opportunities are on a first come, first served basis, be sure to utilize that in your copy when you send out the recording to the rest of your investors who couldn't attend, right? We're just talking about that. Many times we've actually raised some, if not most or all, of the capital required for the deal just on the webinar alone. So those that missed it, missed the opportunity. So it's like, hey, join the flipping webinar. You want to be on the webinar because we're going to raise a lot of cash once this webinar is done. And so if we're full, then we're full. Sorry, you missed out on the opportunity. But nonetheless, I'm always going to record it anyway, because even if we did raise it all, at least I recorded it just in case, and I'll still put it up on the portal for those that are maybe still in a, like they've committed, but they're not like 100% yet. So they can go back and watch the recording if they feel like they needed to or need some more information. Number 5, investor webinar frequently asked questions. This is going to be the part we spend the most time on. So, ready to host an investor webinar, but not sure what questions you'll be asked? Well, let's look at some frequently asked questions to get you up and running. In the investor webinars I've attended or hosted, the majority of investor questions tend to fall into these 5 categories. Number 1, questions about things that are already in the investment summary. Literally something you've already gone over in the call, and people ask a question about it. It's like, well, if you were listening, but we'll talk about why it's kind of important that they ask that anyway. Kind of a neat little thought process. But number 2, questions that ask what if. It's everyone's favorite freaking question. Well, what if this happens? Well, what if the whole property burns down to a crisp? Well, what if, man? I mean, we planned for it and we talked about how we planned for it, but I'll let you know what we would do anyway if that happened. Number 3, questions to ask why. Why are we investing in this market? Why are we investing in this particular deal? Why now? Why with this interest rate? Why? Number 4, questions about things that you found through your own research. So the deeper due diligence that you did and the facts that you brought to the table, or facts that your actual investors found and are bringing to the table that maybe you didn't talk about specifically. And they were like, hey, I noticed that the property across the street, just like there's a brand new build that just happened right across the street. You know, is that going to affect occupancy? Is that competition for us or whatever, right? Or I was looking at pictures online and I saw that all the roofs looked really old, but you didn't have anything in your business strategy that said that you were replacing any of the roofs. Are those pictures just old, or are the roofs actually old and you don't know what you're talking about and you're not planning on replacing any of the roofs, right? Questions about things that they actually found when they were looking into the deal before jumping on the webinar. And number 5, questions about logistics. So number 1, questions about things that are already in the investment summary. This is a fun one, right? Take some courage from the LP perspective to knowingly ask a question whose answer can be found in the investment summary. Whether or not they feel like it's actually taking courage, or they really just weren't listening. So after all, doesn't it show that they didn't fully read or listen to anything that you were saying? Not necessarily. Sometimes I ask a question whose answer I already found in the investment summary for the express reason of hearing the sponsor's answer to it directly, because it could be a little different than what they've actually put in the summary. I want to know how they're thinking about that piece of the investment and how they talk about it, not just what the technical answer is. So the example question is, what is the frequency of distributions? The investment summary answer, if I just looked at what they said, it says that it's quarterly, starting 6 months after closing. Doesn't really give me a lot of information. So when I ask the question, then they say, based on, this is an actual answer I got. Sponsor answer, great question. The distributions will be quarterly, starting 6 months after closing. This gives us time to stabilize the property. Also gives us time to hit the renovations hard. We'll have a catch up on the preferred returns and anticipate that the preferred return will be shored up by the 18-month mark. Also want to reiterate that we don't get paid an asset management fee unless the asset is doing well and is generating returns above 8%. This ensures that our interests are aligned with yours. See, simple question whose answer I could easily have looked up myself, but by asking the question, I've learned how the sponsor is thinking about the distributions. I've learned a little bit more about their integrity and the value that they actually place on their relationship with investors. So the simple question, sometimes it's good to ask it anyway, specifically if you're looking to invest in someone else's deal, but also if, as you're hosting your webinar, when people ask you, you have an LP ask you a question that you've already talked about or stated, like quarterly starting 6 months after closing, try not to get frustrated. Right? Try not to be like, why weren't they freaking listening? I don't want to say this all over again. Try to just understand that they're coming from a little bit different perspective, or maybe they were just ignorant and weren't listening. Either way it goes, right? Try to be professional and give a little bit more of a detailed explanation. The best thing you can do when an LP is asking you a question, specifically on a webinar, you're going to record, and like hundreds, if not thousands of investors are going to be watching this. is to make sure that you answer it as detailed as you possibly can. So when they ask you a quick, simple question, what's the frequency of distributions? And you answer it just like you wrote it in the summary. Oh, well, they're going to be quarterly, but they're going to start 6 months after closing. If that's literally all you say, that doesn't give a lot of people insight into your thought process. And it also just makes you look, I don't know, kind of ignorant, I guess, because like maybe you don't even really fully know the answer of why that is, because then maybe they'll just follow it up with another question like, well, why doesn't it start until 6 months after closing? And then you'll have to answer it anyway. So why not just go ahead and answer it up front? Prove a little integrity just strictly from the question. More example investor questions. What are the acquisition asset management fees? What's the projected hold time? What's the renovation budget per unit? Again, these are all questions you can find the answers to yourself. By asking them directly to the sponsor, you're able to learn not just what the answer is, but how the sponsor is actually answering it, which speaks volumes. Number 2, questions that ask, what if? These are questions that ensure that the sponsor has thought of multiple scenarios, has a variety of backup plans and exit strategies in place to protect investors' money and ensure the success of the investment. Example questions is, what if we had to foreclose on the property? What if we had a downturn? What if vacancy is 25%? What if renovations take longer than expected? Right? There's a gazillion questions we can ask about what if. And honestly, one of the more favored questions that we've got time and time again on webinars is they want to know detailed specifics about the actual insurance policy that you're getting on the property. And they want to know what it covers, what are the deductibles, do we actually have the deductible amounts in reserves, or is there going to be a capital call if something happens and you got to pay $50,000 for a deductible, but we don't have 50 grand, so you're doing a cap call for 50 grand. Is that already going to be in the budget? If worst case actually happens. And then on top of that, they want to know, even if we do have insurance and even if you're covered for everything and we've got the best policy and it's at a great rate and all these things are hunky-dory, when something actually happens, or what if something happens, do we have the cash to get the property up and running back to the position at which it was? Or will we be waiting on the insurance company to actually go through their long, drawn out, extended process to get us that cash from the claim? I've had that question before, and it's like, that is a great question, right? Because what if we had a fire, or if, for instance, with the 148 unit property that we have, where 16 of our units just decided to flood, all the plumbing burst. It's taken 7 months roughly to actually get the insurance claim payout for that claim. 7 months. So you can imagine what we don't want to do, and what the LP or investor looking to invest with you doesn't want to happen, is if something like that happens, they want to know that we have raised or have the buffer or the working capital to be able to start renovations, start work, mitigate the problem, get those properties up and running and back to where they need to be with the cash we already have on hand. They don't want to hear that you don't have the cash and that we're going to have to wait on the insurance company to pay out the claim, because that could take 7 months, right? And we don't want all these units vacant for 7 months, because that's going to hit NOI, that's going to hit our ability to pay prefs, it's going to hit a lot of different things. So that's a question I've had as well. A lot of the what ifs that we've had have come specifically around insurance. So what we've tried to do with our actual presentations, with the webinars themselves, is include as many detailed specifics either in the actual deck or just in our verbal explanation on the recording about insurance. And here's and sometimes we'll go over that when we're actually looking at the budget and when we're going over the business plan. Like, here's the budget, we're putting $200,000 in working capital, we've got another 150 in reserves, and we're setting aside $300 per door annually for additional working capital reserves. And the reason that we've decided on these numbers is because, and then you can go into, because insurance is this, and here's where this policy comes into play, and we're covered for all these different things, but here's the deductible. So if this happens, we have working capital, and you just start explaining it and trying to give as much detail as you can. Oh, that's delicious. Any of you guys like the new peppermint shake? That's what I'm drinking. Chick-fil-A peppermint shake. That's good. All right.
Good stuff.
Number 3, questions that ask why. Every preschooler's favorite question and every parent's nemesis. Asking why allows you to think about the investment with wonder and curiosity. Maybe you know that the projected hold time is 5 years. But how did the sponsors come up with that timeline? Is it just the default timeline they use with all their projects? Are they building in a buffer to let the asset appreciate? Are they trying to base it on appreciation? Is this a speculative play? Are we waiting to hit year 5 or year whatever to sell? Because at that time frame, they're getting their promote. There's questions that you can actually ask, of course, if you're looking to make an investment, but questions that LPs are going to ask too when you start explaining the structure of the deal in and of itself. They're going to know why are you structuring it that way? Why are we trying to sell in 5 years? What's your opinion on where we'll be in 5 years? How are we planning for worst case scenario? If 5 years comes and we can't sell, is there a backup plan? Help me understand, why we've decided on this setup. Asking a why question will allow the sponsor to adjust the reasoning behind the choices that they make, why the investment is structured as it is. Good sponsors will answer why questions with patience and confidence. Any signs of defensiveness, and investors will put up a red flag. So if anyone ever asks you why, just make sure that you're calm, cool, collected. And they're not like, well, why are we doing this? And they have this rude tone in their voice, because I've had that before. Because then they're like insinuating that you're an idiot because you're doing it that way. And so you just calm, cool, collected, answer the question and explain it with as many facts as you possibly can. Because that'll really stop them in their tracks. And then not like you're trying to make them look like an idiot, but it'll almost make them look like an idiot of here's exactly why we've thought about everything. Here's all the plans that we have. Here's why it's structured with the perpetuity model. Here's why we like the long-term hold. Here's why we believe we can refi in 3 years. Here's why we believe we can pull out 100% in 3 years, right? All those why questions. Example in questions, why is the exit cap rate projected to be 5.5%? That's another question I've gotten a lot. The exit cap rate. That's why we talked about it a lot when we were going over underwriting, because it is very important. And just changing the exit cap rate by 20 basis points can change the end financials drastically, right? So making sure that we are being as strategic, as realistic, as conservative as we possibly can on the exit cap rate, so that our estimations of where we're actually going to be are just that. They're legitimately realistic. And we're not just shooting some pie in the sky number on a spreadsheet of look, guys, we can quadruple your money in 60 days or less. This is going to be great. Best deal of a lifetime right here. No, it's legitimately going to take probably about 3, 4, 5 years before we can hit the refi. Here's why we believe it's going to take that long. Here's where the exit cap rate is. Here's why the exit cap rate is where it is. We believe it's going to be here because the market is starting to shift in this direction. And, Mobile, Alabama specifically has somewhat of a hedge against a lot of the outside factors of the world, because we've got this pool and this job pool and this thing going on and this going on. There's been over $1 billion invested, and there's been this, and you just start explaining all these things. Now, you don't want to over explain, so there's definitely a balance, but as much detail as you can give that makes investors feel comfortable and confident in your ability to execute and your actual underwriting and business plan, obviously is going to help them make a better educated decision on whether or not, one, you're the right investor or the right sponsor, but of course, two, whether or not they're going to invest. Why is the first year return significantly lower than subsequent years? Why is the plan only to renovate 75% of the units? I put in these questions because these are all questions I've gotten. And they're sometimes frustrating because it's why don't people know this? But you'd be surprised. There's just so many people out there that are looking to invest that aren't just nearly as knowledgeable as you are. They aren't as knowledgeable as the active investor out there doing this day in and day out. So hey, how come the first year we've got like you told me you're going to pay me an 8 pref, but the first year I'm only getting a 1% pref, and then you're not able to make it up until the second year or until the third year? Why is that the case? Or is it even being made up, right? Is it cumulative? Is it not cumulative? They start asking all these questions. And then the same thing for why are we only renovating 75% or 50% or 25% of the units? Why aren't we renovating 100%? Are we trying to maximize NOI here? Are we trying to maximize how much cash we can make? I'm just absolutely we are. But what you don't know, or what we already told you that maybe you weren't listening to, is that 50% of the units were already renovated by the current owner. So we only have to renovate the remaining 50%. They're like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. Number 4, questions about things you found through your own research. Now, again, this is you finding that research and with your own due diligence that you're going to explain to them, or this is your LPs coming up and finding information on their own due diligence and asking you questions and hoping that you know the answer, or maybe they're shining light on something that you didn't know. So hopefully you've done enough due diligence to know what they may or may not be asking you. But I would be lying if I told you that never has an investor asked me a question that I didn't know the answer to. Definitely there's been a time or two where they asked me a question about something they found or research that they pinpointed out that I was like, I didn't know that. We'll do a deeper dive into that. We'll do some more research. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. Whatever. During your own due diligence, you'll likely surface some information about the property or the market that's not included in the investment summaries. Might be through Google searches, Yelp reviews, your own personal experience with the market, previous deals you've done. Regardless, the webinar is a great opportunity for you to share the insights you've gained with your investors to further solidify your position as an expert and to aid in their comfort of knowing you've done your due diligence. Example questions that they'll probably be asking you: saw that there's a potential new development going in across the street from this property. How's this actually going to impact this investment? According to reviews of the property, lots of previous tenants have complained about poor external lighting. What's your plan to address these complaints and improve the safety of the community? From Google Maps, it looks like the roof on one building is older than the others. Have you found that to be the case through your due diligence? And if so, have you actually put any plans in place to be able to replace that? Is there being CapEx raised to replace that? Is it going to be replaced the next 1 to 2 years? How are we planning to actually have the cash to do that? Now, I'm gonna be honest with you, there's a lot of LPs out there that are going to join your webinar that aren't going to be extremely sophisticated. So they're probably not even going to ask a lot of these questions. So there won't even necessarily be things that you have to worry about. But those that are sophisticated, those that have that are a little bit more weary or that do a lot of due diligence are definitely going to ask you a lot of these questions. And those that are a little more experienced, that have more access to capital, which are the investors you want at the end of the day, they're definitely going to be the ones that ask you these questions. So this is why we're kind of preparing for that scalability effect as we grow here. And lastly, number 5, questions about logistics. These are questions about all the little things that are on your investor's mind. They may be well aware that the property's in a great submarket, the sponsors have a terrific track record, but how exactly will they receive their distribution checks? When will the PPM be available for them to review? Again, that's why we like to have it ready by the time we do the webinar. Chances are, if they're wondering about it, someone else is too. Questions like this may be simple for the sponsor to answer, but remember, it's not what you say, but how you say it. This will clue them into the kind of partner that you will be throughout the project lifecycle. Example questions: when is the target close date? Are you investing in this opportunity personally? I get that question almost every time that we do a webinar. They want to know are the GPs, are you actually putting your own capital into the deal? And 10 times out of 10, every deal we've ever done, GPs have invested in the deal as well. And that's what I would recommend for you. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't have a lot of cash, how am I going to invest into the deal? Well, one thing you can do, I know it's maybe a little bit counterintuitive, especially if you're looking to get that, you're really excited about that acquisition fee. One thing you could do is you could actually take the fee that you're going to earn and you can roll that into an LP spot. So you can just roll that into an actual investment into the deal. So you'll never actually receive the cash into your bank account, but once it goes in, once everyone, because you're raising it from investors, right? You're raising all that capital from investors. So let's say your acquisition fee was going to be $100,000. Well, you can just sign all the docs that say your $100,000 acquisition fee is going to remain in the deal as an LP spot, as part of the total $1 million raise or whatever the total raise is. And then, of course, if it was $1 million and you put in $100,000 and you'd own 10% of that 70% per right share or whatever, and that way you can say that you're invested in the deal through your acquisition fee. That's a way to do it. But that is definitely a question I get a lot. Are you investing in this opportunity personally? And granted, when I was first getting started, as most of you know, I didn't have a lot of cash, if any, to do much. So I was still able to answer the question, yes, because my 2 business partners were putting their own cash into the deal. So the question is typically primarily, are the GPs going to be investing in this alongside with the LPs? Since I was a GP, since they're GPs, we're all GPs together, I could say yes, right? Most people aren't literally wanting to know, are you and your bank account and your cash going to be investing? They just want to know, are the GPs going to be aligned with the LPs? What communication should I expect before and after the property closes? It's definitely another question I get a lot. Are you doing monthly communications, quarterly communications? How are those communications going to be distributed? Is it going to just come through an email? Are you going to do a video through the communications? Is it just going to, are you just sending out text messages? Is it not even going to be an email? Is it going to come through the portal? Is it going to come to my personal inbox outside of the portal? How am I actually getting communicated with? And then what is actually going to be included in the communications has been a question I've got. Are you going to include the, projected financials versus where we actually are, so I can get a good, deep, detailed understanding of how well you're performing with where you initially were projecting? Or am I going to have to do the legwork to go find projections, but you're going to give me the actual financials every month or every quarter that I can take and look at? So what we do is we usually like to send just the actuals. So we don't typically get projected and actuals. We just send the actual financials of that month or of that quarter, depending on how we're doing distributions for that particular asset. And then we also send it out in email format, so they get a written explanation of everything that happened. And then I also do a little recorded video in there of me explaining really just a lot that's already included in there word for word. But then they get to see my enthusiasm. They get to see me. They get to hear from me. You get to see that I'm a human and that it's not a robot, right? It's just a little bit of an additional personal touch, them actually getting to see you in a video. It's not like the video is long either, right? Most of the time, the video is like 5 to 15 minutes max of me just explaining stuff that's happened and crazy things. And sometimes you can laugh a little bit about it if something like really ridiculous has happened. Like when we got sued by those people we had to evict at that one property, I had a good laugh on the video about that one. Like, yeah, we're getting sued, but don't worry. Everything's under control. It's you can let a little bit of your personality out in the video, which just helps you closer connect with your LPs. Can I send in a check rather than wiring my money? We never accept checks. We used to. Bad mistake. Don't ever accept checks. Don't ever accept cash. Obviously, only wires or ACHs. Prefer an ACH because then no one has to pay any wire fees. But if you have to do a wire, you can go with wire. Now, the portal that we've hooked up, we can just do ACHs. However, if they still feel like they don't want to do the ACH and they want to do the wire, whatever, we'll give you either or, but it has to be ACH or wire. And then same thing for distributions. We used to send checks out because some people didn't have their information set up in the portal to get ACH distributions. And now we require it. It's like, look, you are not getting your distribution until you set up your ACH information in the portal. Sorry, we've got it. I'm just going to hold on to it. It's going to stay in the bank until you take the 5-10 minutes that it takes to log in, update your ACH information, and I can just direct deposit it. Because there's been money lost. There's been the wrong check sent to the wrong address. There's been so much happening with checks. So checks, just no bueno. And lastly, number 6, plan ahead. Think about all the questions that your investors may or may not ask you and try to include them in your presentation. Webinars are a monumental proponent to a successful capital raise. They open up the lines of communication between sponsors and investors and allow everyone to get to know each other better and build the foundation of a potential long-term relationship. Whether you go to investor webinar just to listen or because you're looking to invest with that sponsor yourself, or of course you're hosting your own, you'll likely gain a ton of valuable insights and perspectives from both the sponsor overview as well as the questions that other investors ask. When thinking critically about the deal and trying to come up with some of the questions to ask during an investor webinar, remember to consider the 5 most frequently asked question types: questions about things that are already in the investment summary, questions that ask what if, questions that ask why, questions about things you've found through your own research, and questions about logistics. You know what they say, there's no such thing as a dumb question. It's especially true when it comes to making a potentially sizable investment. So be sure to prioritize actually hosting, answering those questions, or attending the actual investment webinar, whether you're on the side of wanting to invest or you're on the GP side. Pay attention not just to what the sponsors are saying or what you're saying, but pay attention to how you actually say it. That is it for part 8 of webinar specifics. So before jumping into the next piece, I think we may have a little bit of time here. Did anyone have any questions about webinars and putting it together. Is anyone putting one together right now? And you had some questions about how to put it together or what that looked like. Anything for me?
You just use Zoom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I pay for the premium for Zoom. It's like $140 or something for the year, so very reasonable. And that allows me to do meetings. So I don't actually do the webinar. They have a webinar section and they have a meeting section. I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this. Now that I'm thinking about it, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I set up the meeting because the meeting allows me to do everything that the webinar does. And for me, it's always just been simpler. So I set up the meeting for a specific time, date, everything that I'm going to tell the investors of when it's going to be. I set up I never do a passcode. I don't want people to have to type in a passcode just to enter, but I always do the waiting room. So typically when we actually come to do the webinar, it's me and all the GPs that get on like 15 to 30 minutes before we know we're actually going to be going live. And we kind of prep a little bit, talk about what we're going to talk about, kind of position ourselves to be ready to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we're going to be very professional, or as professional as we possibly can be once we go live. So set up the meeting, set it up for the specific time, and then when it gives you a link for people to actually register. So instead of what we do with this, where you just get a link and you just join just at your leisure, what we do is we make them actually have to register. So then we get to see how many people are actually going to be joining. And if it's going to be a massive amount of people, if we were going to have like 100 to 200 people trying to join the webinar, then we may have to do 2 webinars. We may not be able to do just one because there may be too many questions and not enough time for us to answer all the questions. So if that's the case, we may just divvy it up into 2. We may say, hey, we're going to have another webinar 2 days from now, 3 days from now. And we'll figure out how to divvy that up. Now, I'm gonna be honest, we've never actually had to do that. I've heard other sponsors that have, but I think the most amount of people we've ever had on a webinar is like 80, 85. Even if you have like 2,000 people in your investor list, not a lot of people are really going to show up to the actual webinar, which again is why we always record it. Because not everyone can always make it. Maybe it's just not good timing for them. Maybe they got something going on, personal, whatever. It doesn't mean they're not interested. They want to watch the recording. So that's why we record it. So we set it up and then make sure that they have to actually register. So then you get a specific link to register, not a link to join, but to register. So then that link is what we put in the email blast when we send out the email saying we've got a new deal and here's when the webinar is going to be. If you're interested in attending the webinar, just click on the link below and sign up. And then when they sign up, of course, you get to see their name, email address, all that good jazz of like who's actually going to be joining. And you're like, oh, cool. I didn't even know this person like wanted to invest and they signed up for the webinar. Now I'm excited. And then you can reach out to them maybe before even the webinar. Like, hey, bro, saw you signed up. I didn't know you were interested in investing in this one. And then maybe you can have a preemptive conversation with that person. So definitely the scheduling or the registering has helped us a lot.
Thank you. So besides Zoom, have you seen other platforms that are maybe useful? I think Zoom's great. It's probably one of the best, but just curious.
Well, there's Google Hangouts. I think that was the other one I had in there. I've seen some other people use that, Google Hangouts, and I honestly heard of a new one, and now you're putting me on the spot. I completely forgot what it was, but there was a new company that does just like this, like Zoom. It's like Just Be You, or gosh, I don't remember what the name of the company was. I'll figure it out, but it didn't look as professional to me, that platform anyway. So my recommendation would be Zoom number 1, and then I've seen Google Hangouts work before, or Google Meet, whatever it's called. And then maybe you could find another one. I don't know. But I like Zoom too because of what I was just talking about with the whole scheduling aspect. The scheduling was really beneficial and very effective, because a lot of platforms will say they have the ability to do webinars and schedules and all this, that, and the other. And then they're like software malfunctions. And then it just makes you look like you're unprofessional because you don't know what you're doing. Like, hey, I tried to sign up for your webinar and it won't let me, saying my email address is invalid or whatever. And you're like, oh my gosh. And then you got to figure that out. So just using a reputable company that you know is going to be effective and efficient has helped us a lot. And again, the premium for Zoom is like $140 for the whole year. So definitely worth it in my mind.
Hey, Josh, I got a few questions. So how far out from closing would you schedule the webinar?
We like to have the webinar set up roughly 4 weeks, I'd say, before actual closing. Maybe 3 weeks. Maybe the latest we've done it is 3 weeks before closing. Because again, the webinar is kind of the focal point for when a lot of people are going to be kind of making their decision. Typically, you've blasted out the data, you've sent the email, you've had the phone call, you shot the text message, you did whatever. They saw the pitch deck, they got to briefly look at it, they got to talk to their spouse, they got to talk to their financial advisor, they got to talk to whoever they got to talk to, their CPA, figure out where this money's coming from, make a decision on whether or not they're going to invest, like whether or not they actually have the cash to. And then the webinar is kind of their decision of whether or not this actual investment or you are right for them. So that kind of being the focal point, the focal decision time frame, we like to have that really 4 weeks out before closing, because then everyone's got to go through the portal and everyone's got to sign all the docs and put in their commitments, and then they have to actually wire the money or ACH the money. And we like to try, of course, it doesn't always happen. We like to try to have all the cash in the account at least 2, at the latest 1 week before closing. That's usually at least the deadline that we give all of our investors. And of course, there's always those few lagging investors that are like, wait, I'm doing an IRA account and my custodian's delaying. It's like, all right, I mean, we'll hold your spot. We know you're committed. I'm not going to like screw you, but it just sucks that it's taken this long to get the money in. I'm not going to lie. There's been a time or two that we've had to put our own money into the deal just to close it. And then we had already like raised it, right? But the cash hadn't hit the account yet, or they were delaying, or they were like, hey, I'm committed. I'm going to invest with you. But I got this other deal that closes the same day yours closes. And once that closes, I'll have, 50 grand, or I'll have 100 grand. And I want to put that in your deal. It's like, that's almost kind of speculative, because if your deal doesn't close, then I'm screwed. But if it's only like 1 or 2 investors that have that crazy scenario, then we're like, sure, right? We'll let it happen. So then we know we're not even going to get that money until after we close anyway. So sometimes we've had to put our own cash in just to get across the finish line. But then of course you raise for it and get reimbursed after closing. That's not always the case, but that's what I would say. 4 weeks, 3 weeks at the latest is when we like to have the webinar.
All right. 2 more questions, because I know we got to move on. You mentioned about the equity that's invested by the GP. What percentage? What's the typical percentage for that?
Well, as far as lenders are concerned, depending on the lending that you actually get for the asset, they typically want to see about 5 to 10%. Depends on the lender. So if you're raising $1 million, they want to see that you've got $50,000 to $100,000 on the GP side in the actual deal. Now, again, that's typically from a lender perspective. Now, from like a standardized just GP perspective, there's really no standard. Everything's different. Like this last deal that we did, the Riverside deal where we had to raise 5.6, 118 unit Class A property. Out of the 5.6, $1 million of that was GP cash. So $1 million was obviously more than 10% out of that total. So we really liked that deal and wanted to put as much cash as we possibly could into it. So there's really no standard for that, but you could do whatever you wanted. And we've been able to find that with local banks, sometimes bridge lenders, but of course you don't want to do bridge debt right now. They don't require. It's typically the agencies or the larger institutions that require you as the GP to have a specific amount of cash actually in the deal. And the local banks typically don't have that requirement. So it can all come from the LPs. It can all come from wherever. They don't care. They're really looking at the asset itself and its ability to perform. Now, the caveat here, the quick pro quo tip is that even if you come to the point where you and your business partners are putting together a deal and it's a fairly sizable deal, and you got to come up with 200 grand, and that's like your 5 or 10% of like total cash. And it has to be on the GP side. And you got this really awesome quote from a lender, but that's what they're like. Everything's great with the lender except for that one requirement. And you're like, I really want to go with Sloan. The interest rate's great. The terms are great. Everything's great, but that's not great because I don't have 200 grand, and none of us have 200 grand. What you can do, what some people have done before, we've thought about doing, but we never executed on it because we were able to come up with the money, is you can have an LP come in, an LP that's going to invest 200K, or you can just have two LPs, each to 100 or whatever, how many LPs you need to equate to the number. But the preferred method would be, if you needed 200K in this particular example scenario, you've got one investor that comes in and invests 200K on the LP side, and you also give them a slice of the GP equity. So you're like, hey, we need someone on the GP team that is putting up 200K. We'll let you have your LP spot, and we'll also give you some GP equity if you'd be willing to sign, this non-recourse loan, sign that you're on the GP team. We'll give you like 2% or 3% or whatever. Like, you'll get an extra sliver of the pie for helping us meet that threshold. I've seen people do that before, and it's worked out great for them.
Mhm. Interesting.
Hey,
My last-
Josh, this is Alex.
Kevin, did you have one last question?
Yeah, just one last question. This is around the investor's question. So in order to address that, would it make sense to kind of have like an FAQ included in the webinar? I've actually sat on probably about 20 live webinars, and majority of them have some type of FAQ, towards the end of the deck or something like that, that addresses all of the basic questions that they may get asked.
Yeah, no, definitely. We've always included frequently asked questions section at the end of each webinar. But again, like some of the things that we talked about, even though there may be an answer in the FAQ, because typically what we do, I don't know how you've seen it in some of the webinars you've been a part of, but basically the way we do the FAQ is we have the question actually like in the pitch deck itself of whatever the question is, and then we have the answer written out in the pitch deck. And so same thing with that example question that we were talking about with the first question, where, how often will distributions be made, or when will the first distribution be made? And it was like, distributions will be quarterly, but the first distribution won't be paid out until after 6 months. Like, that's what we would write as the answer to the frequently asked question. But then the LP, when they actually ask the question, that's when the answer gets a little bit more detailed. Like, well, why is it going to take 6 months until we get to that point? Tell me a little bit more about your integrity. Tell me a little bit more about why that's the case. Tell me a little bit more about how that helps me understand how you have my best interests at heart. So even though it'll be in the FAQs, we've still gotten a lot of those questions. Like, we'll literally be going over them. We're like, frequently asked questions, we got this and this and this. And then once we finish all that, we're like, does anyone have any questions? And then they ask the same questions that were in the FAQ, which is fine, whatever, that's what we're just talking about. Just make sure you answer them and give a little bit more detailed information behind your answer, as opposed to literally just what was printed on the page of what they just saw.
Wow. There was one particular call that I was on, and it was a great presentation. One of the LP investors got online and asked the sponsor who was presenting basically a question about his previous criminal conviction.
Criminal
And
conviction?
Yeah, and there was complete silence on the call, like literally. And it was the weirdest thing I ever seen.
Was he actually criminally convicted? Was that like
Yeah.
legit?
Yeah, apparently the guy did some research and found out that, this guy had some bad business dealings with drugs or something like that, or something he was part of, and he went to jail and, spent a couple of months in prison and got out. And I mean, he was doing well for himself, but he had that, as part of his history. And I just thought it was the weirdest thing.
Oh, did y'all hear about that guy? I don't remember his name. I feel like I should. Onofrio. Matt Onofrio, is that his name? Did y'all hear about that? Oh, you posted about it. Yeah, you posted about it, Michael. You posted it in the chat. I don't know if anyone else had a chance to look at it. John was just on here. He was commenting, but that dude like grew rapidly, scaled like crazy, was on all the major podcasts, was at all the major conferences, was like a big speaker in the space, invited to everything. He was on the Bigger Pockets podcast. He had a book contract with them where they were getting ready to release a book that he had written, and Bigger Pockets was going to publish it and do all the marketing and blasting out for it. He's this big dude in the space, like went from nothing to $150 million in net worth, not assets under management, net worth in like 3 years, did it all with triple net lease deals. It was this whole big thing. He was this big expert. And then come to find out he was indicted for like 35 million or $50 million bank fraud.
Oh man.
And is potentially going to do like 10, 20 years in jail. And Bigger Pockets canceled their book dealing with him. They deleted his podcast episode that they had released. They deleted his account. Whole thing. It was a big deal. Anyway, side tangent. All I have to say, you want to make sure who you're actually investing with, who you're getting into bed with as a business partner. Are they actually reputable? Are they not? It's only something you're going to be able to tell.
I think I'll also add that if they have a history, but they've since cleaned okay to invest with them. I know someone that is doing, like, he spent his time in prison, but that was 15 years ago, and he's totally cleaned up, and what he's doing now is sober living facilities, and so he's like actually helping the community that was him at some point. So I'll just say, yes, do your due diligence. If they have a criminal record, Kevin, great, ask them about it. If they don't say anything, that's probably concerning. If they like, there's a story there, I'm sure. So
yeah, I would never ask anyone that. If I had any curiosity about someone's past, I would do that offline. I think that would be the proper way to do it, than on a call with potential investors.
That's pretty
And as you can imagine, he didn't close on that deal. So
oh man. So Josh, that begs a question. I'm gonna give some context to my question. I'm working with a real estate attorney right now, and he drew up a PPM for a syndication that he was doing with someone else. And they have, some kind of criminal record as well. And it was in the past. Is that something you're required to put in the PPM? Like, he was making him do it because it was his first time drafting up a PPM, but like, I don't know. Have you seen that in the past? Any disclosures like that?
I'm gonna be honest. I've never dealt with anyone on the GP team that was criminally inclined or indicted. So I've never personally had to do that. I guess it would really just be up to the attorney. The attorney would know that in more depth about the state regulations, or maybe it's SEC guidelines or rules that state that you would have to make sure that you disclose that information. But another thing is, if you do have a criminal record, or if you're partnering with someone that has a criminal record, just know when even if they've gotten clean, like they could be the best guy on the planet now, turn their life around, like you were talking about, Luke. Dude's great. He's like helping people now. That's fantastic. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to partner with that guy either, like you're saying. But one thing to note is that the SEC is going to have like 10 times the amount of eyeballs on you, knowing that that person had a criminal background, even if it had nothing to do with what it is you're doing now. If it was just drug related or whatever, they don't care. The fact that you are a criminal and are trying to raise a ton of money and do a security, they're going to be hardcore analyzing everything that you do. And if you slip up, there you go. It's not only that criminal individual's record that's tainted, but now forever it'll be on your record that you have broken an SEC guideline and you may possibly never be able to syndicate again. So it's definitely something it's not something to like play around with. And if you are going to partner with someone that, has that, even if you're not partnering with someone that has that, it's always important to make sure that you're following the rules, restrictions, which you guys already know. We talked about a lot of that, but Alex, I think you had a question before we started chatting.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor your time because I know our time's up. Two-pronged question. Number one, when you promote or you make the offer to invest to investors, don't we have to have 3 tangible touches with them, significant conversations with them? And should the syndication attorney be the one pitching the investment portion? Or do you guys do it as GPs? Number one. Number two, what properties do you have coming up the pipeline that we can participate as LPs?
Wow, 2 good questions. The first question, I think you said, does the attorney, is he the one that's pitching the deal? Is that what you said?
Right. So to fall in line with the SEC rules and regulations, obviously we're not brokers, we're not investment people, we're not attorneys, right? But when you're trying to raise these funds, we have to have 3 significant conversations, and significance is very generalized, right? And the SEC rule.
Yeah.
But should that syndication attorney be the one making that pitch to the investors? Or are we as LPs allowed to, or the one getting the deal together, to do this? And what rules do we need to follow to not overpromise, especially preferred rates and such? So I'm trying to figure out the proper SEC rules and regulations to pitch deals.
Right. So you'll definitely be the one pitching the deal. You as the GP, you as the sponsor, you'll be the one telling all your investors about it, whether it's phone call, text message, in person, Zoom, email blast, whatever your marketing method is, or if you do a 506c and it's on social media, like, you will be the one that is telling, educating, and letting people know about your specific investment for that investor to want to invest with you and in that deal. It won't be the attorney that's actually pitching that. Of course, the attorney will be the one that puts together the PPM docs, the subscription docs, the company agreement, all the docs you need to be SEC legal. And as far as like who you can blast out to, the whole 3-touch conversation, it is like probably the biggest gray area in SEC guidelines, because they don't actually have a definitive definition of what pre-existing relationship actually means. So that in the actual guidelines of SEC, it says that you have to have a pre-existing relationship with the individual if you're specifically doing a 506b and able to accept non-accredited or sophisticated investors. And so the rule of thumb, not SEC guideline, but the rule of thumb for what pre-existing relationship is defined as is those 3 touches. Typically what we strive for is anywhere between 2 to 3 touches. Maybe we're pushing the limit of too much, but 2 to 3 touches is kind of what we shoot for. And the first touch can quite literally just be you having a conversation with them over, like, in their direct messages or private messages on social media. So they saw that you posted something about a deal, or that you posted something about whatever, and they're messaging you and talking to you on social media. The second touch can be the actual phone call that you have with them. And the third touch could be you sending in an email afterwards. Thanks so much for having a conversation with me. I know we didn't really get to talk a lot about it, but we do actually have a new investment opportunity, blah, 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 whatever. That could be your third touch, where you actually pitch it. Or you could pitch it on the phone call if you're just shooting for 2 touches. So once you actually get them on the phone, that can technically be your second touch with them, and you can talk about the actual investment opportunity that you have. Now, again, we've talked about this before, and you want to make sure that you actually understand their goals, their needs, what it is they're looking to do. The best you can understand them as a person, of course, the whole rapport building thing, the better ability you'll have to actually determine if your deal or you can actually help them achieve the goal that they're trying to achieve. Because not everyone looking to invest is looking to invest in what you are or has the same goals that you do. So if they're looking to do something similar to you, then great. That's where you can really connect and say, I've got deals coming down the pipe. I've got a deal right now that we're actually raising for, just went live today, just went live yesterday. and here's some of the high level details on it. If you're interested, we're doing a webinar. It's going to be in another week or so. Love to have you come out and join. I'll send you the link now to sign up, to register, or however you want to do it. But the whole pre-existing relationship thing, the 1 or 2 touches, you want to make sure that you're like documenting that. So if it's in the PMs, if it's in the DMs on social media, that's obviously documented. It's going to stay there to show that you had a conversation with them at XYZ date. But if it's a phone call or something like that, you can throw that in your CRM or throw that in a spreadsheet if you're doing that, just to say that you had a conversation with them on this day, or to say that you've had 2 touches with them. One was on social media, one was here, one was at a coffee shop, one was whatever. What I like to do is I like to just add it in my CRM. So I can literally go to their contact information, because I have everything set up to where when they set up the call in the first place, it all of it goes to the CRM and they get put in the system. So once they get put in the system, once we actually get on the call, I just pull up the CRM on my phone, or I pull up the CRM on like half the screen, and the other half of the screen is Zoom and me chatting with them. And so I'm just taking notes as we're talking in their account on the CRM to state that we talked and here's what we talked about. Here's their goals. Here's what they're shooting for. It also helps me get a better understanding of, data tracking of what it is they are actually trying to achieve. It's like, hey, I had a conversation with this investor 2 years ago. They still haven't invested with us, but I still know what they're interested in because I wrote it down. So that's what I would say to answer question number 1 about pre-existing relationships and whether or not the attorney is going to do it. Question number 2, do we have deals right now that you could potentially passively invest in or be an LP on? Yes, we have a 106 pad RV park development deal that's coming down the pipe. Say coming down the pipe, it's here. We're finalizing due diligence now. We probably won't start raising for it until January, mid-January, maybe late January. The timeline is somewhat up in the air. We've got a very flexible seller though. We're able to go direct to seller, and got a few last T's to cross and I's to dot before we feel really comfortable pressing. So once those happen, we've already got all the SEC docs and everything finalized. So I'll throw it up in the portal, and then at that point, I would let investors like yourself know that the opportunity has presented itself. And that deal, probably the plan is that it will be a perpetuity deal. However, if these last couple of things that come back a little less positive than we'd like, then maybe it will be maybe it'll be a little bit more of a waterfall structure, where it'll be like, you get a 8 pref or you get a 10 pref, and then after 10% up to 15, like once it goes past 10, then it switches to a 50-50 split instead of a 70-30, and then anything past 15 goes 70% to the GPs and 30% to the LPs over that. So obviously it's incentivizing us to do as best we possibly can, and it's kind of like doing the perpetuity model. However, if those things come back and they're not as enticing as we'd like them to be, which basically just means we wouldn't be able to execute on 100% cash out refi at year 2, year 3, and it would be pushed out a couple of years, we'll probably just turn the RV park into somewhat of a 7-8 year deal and sell it. But basically you would get the plan would be to get the 10 pref or the 8 pref or whatever pref we come out with. And you would get that throughout the whole life. If it's not perpetuity, you would get that full 8 to 10 pref for the full 5-10 years. If it is perpetuity, how that would work. You would get it for 2 to 3 years, 100% of your cash back, and then we all just cash flow indefinitely.
Perfect. Look forward to it. Thanks.
Sweet. Well, I guess we have somewhat run out of time. If anyone has any last parting questions, let me know.
A quick question. So for especially a nosy investor, do they ever ask how much exactly you're investing into the deal alongside them?
You individually?
Yeah.
I guess maybe I've gotten that question once or twice. And at that point, you just got to be honest. Definitely don't want to lie. Definitely don't want to be like, well, no, I've got $1 million of my own cash I'm putting in this deal. It's going to be awesome. If I legit don't have the capital or what have you, then I'll say, well, no, me specifically, I'm not putting cash from my personal bank account into this deal. But here's how we've set up the GP, contributions, or the GP LP distributions, or however we're investing into it. And you could say that all the cash that you're investing as a GP is coming out of the business account. So you can say myself and my two business partners, we've all set up a business account called XYZ LLC. The $100,000 that we're investing is in that account. So technically, I'm not investing my money, I'm investing the business's money. And all three of us are investing as a unit. So that's why we just said, as the GP team, we're investing $100,000. Yeah, that's if that's the case. If that's actually what you're doing. That's typically what we do now, and how we invest in our deals. But when you're first starting out, you don't have a business account with a ton of money in it. Everyone's kind of bootstrapping and figuring it out. So if you legitimately aren't putting any of your own cash into it, I would just be honest and say that you're not, but you've got two business partners, or you've got this person over here, you're bringing this person in and they're putting in 100,000 or 50,000, to make sure that we're all kind of aligned together. Now, again, I've maybe once or twice someone's wanted to get like really nosy or granular about me specifically, but most of the time people just ask, our GP's investing into the alongside of the deal. And I'll just say yes. And if they want more granular information, then I'll explain the business account concept to them. So basically it is all of our money, but it's not technically coming out of my personal account.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I love it, fellas. We had some good back and forth questions today. Obviously the webinar is something we need to go over. Now hopefully you guys can execute on some wildly successful webinars. So the other thing we were going to go over, really the part 2, was going to be, we were going to jump into PPM and subscription docs. So we were going to jump into what those docs actually look like why it's structured the way that it's structured, where do investors need to sign, why are certain things included, like why is this section included? Well, it's because you got to follow this guideline that says this, and so here's why we need this doc. Well, why does this got to be signed, and why does it got to be signed this way, and why does the spouse have to sign alongside with it, and why? So we were going to try to just go down the PPN and subscription docs and explain the granularities of that, but obviously we didn't have time, so we'll probably just go over that on, let's see, the next time we'll convene is Monday on the 19th. Absolutely, yes, we'll be meeting on the 19th, this upcoming Monday. So we'll just do it then, make that part 9.